Hi, this is Peter Mortola, and this is Play Becomes Real, the Oaklander approach to Gestalt play and art therapy. This is part two. Today we're going to be talking about first steps. So last time, we covered the introduction in which I addressed how both play and expressive arts are helpful in the therapeutic process, at least an introduction to those ideas. I talked about Violet Oaklander's background and the spread of her work across the world. I talked about what materials and media are used in her approach, as well as some of the findings regarding what makes her approach cross-culturally relevant and why maybe there are so many translated versions of her work across the world. So this time, we're going to cover first steps. And by that I mean I'm going to give some examples. I'm going to ask you to look for examples of at least three of Oaklander's therapeutic experiences. These are very particular um, experiences that she leads clients through. And each of those different therapeutic experiences, whether they're in clay or sand tray or drawing, have a particular four-part structure, which I discovered. So I'm going to ask you to be aware of what that four-part structure of her therapeutic experiences is, and then some prompts from each of those four parts of the therapeutic exercises. And then I'm going to step back a little bit and try to explain how this process happens and how to have a rationale for why this work is effective and important. So I'm going to link ideas of Gestalt formation and projection into how play becomes real, right? So what is behind this play becoming real in the Oaklander approach? So I'll get to that in this talk, as well as some examples of projective assessments and, importantly, some of the uses and misuses of projection, which I think is a pretty key piece that I share today, given that projection is at the heart of what Oaklander does, and we have to treat it respectfully. So first I'm going to talk about form, and what I mean by that is the shape of her therapeutic experiences and what those therapeutic experiences are. So you may have seen the video in which Soren, after being asked to pick a card, an image that somehow represented his experience before, during, and after the group that he participated in, he picked this card. I picked this plant thingy in the desert because I used to be kind of alone. So this is a image. It's a picture card that resonates somehow with Soren's personal experience, right, of being alone. And I think we as viewers look at that image and we can, through our own empathetic understanding, get some of Soren's experience of being alone and what he means by that. Another example of an Oaklander approach, which I'll be structuring here today, is a rosebush drawing. So in this case, I was working with a child. She wrote, after I asked her to draw herself as a plant, as a rosebush, she drew it, and then I asked her to be this rosebush, and she said, I'm this yellow rose, and that is the color of care or serenity. I grow by myself. I'm not in a bunch with others. I'm the kind of rose that can be left alone sometimes. And I ask her, so Rose, what's the advantage of being on your own? And she says, I have space and a life and time of my own. And then I sort of step out of that pretend experience and I say, well, how does this fit for you in your own life? And she says, well, I'm the only child in my household. I have siblings, but most of them live together. I like to spend time on my own. And how will that be a good thing for summer, which was coming up? She said, yeah, we have lots of time alone then. And I said, right, so it's a good thing to know how to be alone for sure. So this is a small example of how something playful, a rose, growing by itself, became kind of real in that it described something about this child's actual experience. Okay, so that was an experience of the rosebush drawing. There are other experiences, therapeutic experiences that I learned from Violet, and they include everything from a safe place drawing to a clay experience, working with clay, to working in a sand tray and with little figurines. anger drawing, working with musical instruments, working with these things called medicine cards, which are basically picture cards of Native American animal totems. There's a demon drawing experience that she did in these 2-week trainings that I would take with her. And there's puppet work, right? So these are different modalities: sand tray, clay, drawing, cards, music, puppets. But what I realized when I was learning from her over time is that even though there's this variety of media and a variety of what I called these therapeutic experiences across media, there was a similar structure to all of them. So they had a actual structural 1, 2, 3, 4 part sequence, which is kind of unusual in some ways because she's a Gestalt therapist, and that's meant to be sort of process oriented and very open. And I think it is very process oriented and very open, but it does have a structure um, in which she that I think really helps facilitate engagement. So I'm going to talk about this structure here. So I identified over time watching her that there were these 4 parts no matter what she was working with. So the first part was an evocation of imagination. So something about an imaginary experience. She didn't start with, how are you doing this week? Or she might ask that at the outset, but she says, all right, we're going to do this experience. So what I want you to do is I want you to imagine yourself as a rose bush. So I think that's interesting because she's pulling on, a childhood strength right off the bat, but she's also pulling you into this sort of playful, this play experience that involves your imagination. And then there was always a second part, which involves sensory expression. So go ahead and draw yourself as that rose bush, or pick a card. Look through these cards and pick them, or let's make something out of clay. Or let's make a scene in the sand. So there was first this imaginary prompt, then the sensory expression of that prompt, and then thirdly, and really quite importantly, I think there was this, what I call narrative metaphoric articulation, but really it's be it. So then she would say, I want you to be this rose bush. Speak as if you are this rose bush. Speak as if you are this piece of clay. I'm this piece of clay. So we'll see this over and over again, but number 3, this part is really where we're facilitating this play experience by actually also being in it. We have to be willing to step into the play experience to facilitate this experience in order for number 4, which is asking, after we kind of step out of this process, we step out of the rose bush drawing and we say, well, so what fits, when you were talking as that rose bush, what fit for you in your own life? And that's this, what I've called sense-making application. And it's a different kind of thinking. It's not playful at that point. It's more sort of cognitive. That other kind of language in number 3 was very narrative and very metaphoric and image, sensory-based. Now number 4 is like, well, what do you think about that? How does it fit for things that are happening in your own life? So here are some examples of the prompts that are used in these 4 parts. So I'm smushing together parts 1 and 2 on this slide, which is both part 1, imagine it, and part 2, make it. So this is prompts from working with drawings, clay, sand tray, picture cards, puppets, music instruments, etc. So for example, pick a card to represent your experience before, during, and after the group. Imagine yourself as a rose bush. Now draw yourself as that rose bush. Again, imagine first, make something sensory-wise second. Draw a symbol to represent everyone in your family. Make a scribble drawing. Close your eyes and start making something with the clay. Make a figure out of the clay to represent everyone in your family. Choose characters and make a scene in the sand. Pick one puppet to represent your fairy godmother. Try out all the musical instruments, then pick one, close your eyes, and play it. So you can see that all of these examples, which are actual transcripts from her work, are first prompting I want you to imagine something, and then I want you to pick and play and choose something, make something physically. So after, and that make it stage, number 2, is often quite silent. Like there's some period where the child is just looking through cards or drawing quietly, and Violet's just sitting there quietly next to the child. So now we step into part 3, which is this narrative metaphoric articulation. So after the child has imagined something, made something, then Violet says, okay, so what part of that stands out to you? Speak as that part. Describe yourself. Say, I am a rosebush, whale, tree in the park, etc. And she'll ask further questions like, what is your context? What's your surroundings? What's your situation? Are you getting enough to eat? Is somebody taking care of you? What is your experience like? Are you doing well? Are there any broken limbs? Is there any part of you that's not doing so well? Is there any scary parts of your environment? Have this part of the drawing over here speak to this part of the drawing over here. First be this part, then be that part responding. So have the thorns talk back to the rose, or the whale talk to part of the whale's environment. And then she'll say, do you want to move, add, subtract something? Does anything seem to be missing? Speak as that. So there's this immersion commitment to let's pretend, let's be in the be it phase. And I do think over time I've noticed that this is one of the more challenging parts for adults doing this work, because this is what we used to do as kids and as graduate students, and people getting our degrees. We're not supposed to start goofing around and pretending. Well, Violet's committed to it because something real happens when we come out of it. And that's the next step, which is stage 4. This question, only later does this fit for you in your own life. So she'll say, for example, to Blake in the clay work that we'll see, you said a lot as that whale about your life. Did any of that fit for you in your own life, Blake? So when she was talking to the whale, she was using the whale. She said, whales, tell me some things about your life. Now she's talking to Blake again, and she says, did any of that fit for you in your own life, Blake? Did anything you shared not fit for you in your own life experience? So what fit and what didn't fit? Because those are both important self-statements, right? Like, yeah, that whale family was just like mine, but no, I don't feel like I don't feel like unsafe in my environment. So that's an important, allowing the child to say both what fits and what doesn't fit. So another example might be, I'm just wondering, is that your whale family? Is your whale family anything like your own family? So you can kind of ask, like, you said all these things, do they fit? And then when you were talking about those bubbles, I noticed your voice changed. What was happening with you then? So that's kind of a further question about does it fit? Like, what was your experience? What experience were you having when you were imagining you were talking as those bubbles? So all this is kind of a processing, or a kind of bringing back into real life this imaginary experience that we've had. So these are the 4 parts. I've also noticed that Violet will often make this sequence iterative, meaning she'll step right back into it after she's gone through the 4 parts. So you'll see that in the clay work with Blake, where she'll have him make something. She says, first close your eyes and make something. Number 2 is make something out of the clay. Number 3 is he becomes a whale. He talks about the whale. Number 4 is the whale family's like his, and then, but there's no father whale in the either the whale family or his real life family, because his father lives somewhere else. So then she goes back in again to the 1, 2, 3, 4, and she says, well, listen, I want you to imagine you can make each of your family members in clay, including your father. And so I want you to take a few minutes to just make those figurines out of clay. So she's again stepped back into the sequence, and she'll sort of what I've conceptualized as follow a figure. She'll find something important and she'll go deeper with that image. So I'm going to give some more example of Violet's work with Blake. This is from Child Therapy with the Experts, Gestalt Therapy with Children. Violet, in the middle of this video, does a piece of work with Blake, who she's never met before, using clay. John Carlson and Don Keat interview her and talk about it both sort of pre and post. So here's the articulation of part 1, the imaginary experience, imagine it. I want you to just take your clay, and I just want you to put both hands on it, and I want you to close your eyes and then take a deep breath. And when you let the air out, imagine it's going right down your arms into the clay. Try that again. Blake takes a second deep breath and smiles with his eyes closed. Now this clay has a lot of your energy in it because you've been fooling with it. Blake at this point sort of peeks to see if Violet has her eyes closed, and then he closes his eyes again. So she's prompted some mindfulness, really, some calming, but also some imagination. Imagine that your energy is in this clay. So then make it. She goes into the second piece of the sequence. So what I want you to do with your eyes closed at first is start making something with the clay. It could just be a shape, or you could imagine you're making an animal or a person, or, you might think you're making something and it might not turn out to be that because your eyes are closed. And it might just be a shape, or it might be a thing, whatever. Just let your fingers move the clay. And sometimes the clay tells you where it wants to go, and sometimes you just have to push so it will know where it wants to go. Yeah, so just let yourself, with your eyes closed, make something. And you'll be surprised because your eyes are closed. And what follows this is a couple of minutes in which they're very quietly sitting side by side, and Blake is kind of eyes closed, pushing the clay around with his hands, making something. So then, after a minute or two, Violet says, okay, Blake, now since a lot of your energy is in this clay, it really is a part of you. So what I'd like you to do is be this piece of clay and tell me about yourself. I'm this piece of clay. And you can just describe how you look or whatever. Just tell me about yourself as this piece of clay. Now, this is a hard thing for kids to step into, or adults, because it's, again, sort of pretend play. So he doesn't step into it right away. Blake says, I don't know how to really describe myself. Well, this is supposed to be a whale. And Violet says, all right, I'm a whale. And Blake says, and whales swim. And Violet interrupts again and says, oh, okay, now here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do this. You're the clay, so you have to say, I'm a whale, and I swim, Yeah, I'm a whale, and I like to swim. So he finally steps into the water, literally, right? And I think this is really one of Violet's skills. Her main tricks up her sleeve is she doesn't let this slide. She really wants you to speak as if you are this thing, and she's going to go there. And she wants you to go there. And it's very directive. It's not non-directive play therapy. But once he steps into that, he can take it whatever direction he wants. So when they have this experience together and they talk as if he's this whale, and he talks about his family and what it's like and so forth, after a while, Violet steps out and says, all right, yeah, I'm just wondering if there's anything about your whale that fits for you, Blake. So she's not talking to the whale anymore. That you could say, yeah, I'm like that too, or that's like my life too, or, and Blake's thinking about it, well, during the summer I basically live in the water. Really? Yes. I guess that's one of your favorite things to do, huh? Swim. Yeah. Uh-huh. Swim, and I'm very active. Whales are active. Uh-huh. Yeah, that's about it. That's about it, but that's a lot too, she says. And I think this is interesting because she often talks about how kids will give you about this much, right? But she pushes it a little further and asks some more questions here. So she says, do you feel safe in the water? I mean, the whale feels safe in the water. Do you feel safe? Yeah, very safe. Uh-huh, very safe. And it sounds like the whale family is a little bit like your family. I have a feeling, I don't know, you have a sister? Yeah. And a mother? And a play grandmother? What is that, a play grandmother? And she says, she's not my real grandmother, but she acts like it. I see. I bet that's nice too, yeah. And what about your father, she says. He lives in Indiana and I don't see him much. Your parents are divorced, yeah. Yeah, do you wish you could see him more? Sometimes, yeah, in different situations. What do you mean? Well, I like to play basketball a lot, and I wish I could see him more to play basketball. Yeah, that's hard when your dad lives far away like that. Okay, so she's taken Blake through these 4 steps of the process, and as I mentioned before, she steps back into it now and has him make a figure for everyone in his family, including his father. Then in step 3 again, she has him talk to those figurines and say one thing he likes and doesn't like, and a whole session is taken up with him then this figure of the difficulty of having an absent father and how he addresses that frustration in his life. and how he sometimes takes it out on his mother. That all emerges out of this play activity and becomes real in his own life. So I've been noticing this over time, and it's been quite a wonder to me about how something. It was one of the first things I remember Violet ever doing, working with somebody and seeing this happen, and I just was like, how does that happen? So I want to try to add some rationale to this. Violet does come from a Gestalt background, and I want to use some of this theory base to explain how play becomes real. So here is an image of a white rectangle and then some black objects on that white surface. And I am going to imagine that you can see the panda bear like I can, right? You can even be able to see the curve of his head and imagine the fuzziness of his cheeks and so forth. This is a principle from Gestalt that is an organized whole that is perceived as more than the sum of its parts. So this panda is not just black splotches on a white screen, it's an actual bear with a mouth and a nose and eyes, right? And this image isn't just green leaves and rosebuds and birds flying, it's actually two faces, right? So we actively pull and organize together the parts of something that we see, and we make them into a whole, an organized whole. So, for example, this is called Gestalt formation and closure. So a Gestalt is a whole, a perceived whole, and Ehrenstein states, in perception there is a tendency to complete unfinished or partially obscured objects, like we do here with this light bulb, right? That's not just a little weird metal thing and a hand in a upside down U shape. That is very clearly a light bulb, and we can draw that line around it. Now this is a principle of perception, and it's neither good nor bad, although it has both aspects to it, because this is also implied in the bias literature, the implicit bias that we bring. We imagine and we make closure on what we see in the environment very quickly. This helped us evolutionarily when we saw two eyes and sharp teeth. We saw a tiger face. We didn't need to see a whole lot more in order to run. But now we bring our own bias to race or gender or whatever we happen to do when we see people, and we decide whether that's a safe thing or a safe person or not safe person. But it's the same principle of Gestalt formation in that we construct wholes out of parts, right? And we finish partially obscured objects. So one way this happens is another idea or part of Gestalt theory is FigureGround. So an area perceived as figure is more differentiated than one perceived as ground. So looking at this image, I don't know if you noticed the little fish down at the bottom jumping up. They're white against the black background. When you see those little fish, you're creating a figure of the fish, and the background is the tree. When you see the lion on the right, you don't necessarily see the tree, but as soon as you look at the tree becomes figure and the lion's face becomes background. So this is part of this process of what we do to make sense of our perception, is we create figures. So I would argue that that is what Blake was doing in the clay, is he creates literally figures, and then he's trying to make sense of what that is. It's a whale. The whale has a context, a ground. It lives with a family. It's safe, etc. So this figure and ground form a gestalt, an organized and meaningful whole. And let me use this picture to help describe what that means. So in the foreground, close to the right side of the page, you see this big sailing ship against a blue sky. But as you move back, following the blue becomes a structure, meaning the blue becomes figural, and the background is the clouds, the white is the clouds. But again, as you move forward, what is figural is the white sails against a blue background. So we are constantly organizing and making meaningful wholes out of what we perceive. And artists have learned to trick us with this, such as this in Escher's work, etc. All right, so this is interesting because, being presented with a visual stimuli creates initial confusion, like in this case. Is this gentleman looking directly at me, or am I looking at his profile? So being able to comprehend a figure and background creates closure and triggers the pleasure centers of the brain by remedying the confusion. So again, evolutionarily, that would make sense. Like, we feel better when we really do make sense of something. And in this image, it's almost made to make us feel confused, right? Because we keep shuttling between his profile and him looking straight at me. But we are working to make sense of the images we're seeing and create strong figures against background. Okay, so Jontif and Fur describe this. A figure arises from the background at each moment and then recedes into the background to make room for another figure. So this is, in Gestalt theory, this is the ongoing healthy process of living, is we make clear figures, we address them, and then they recede and we come up with another one. And I'll describe how this happens through this image of Portland's own Pioneer Square downtown. So if we were walking into this Pioneer Square on this particular day, let's say from the far side where the courthouse is, and we're walking through the beautiful flower beds that are placed there, the figure of the flower beds may become clear, and the background of all the people and that musical band that's playing may disappear a little bit because we're focusing on the figure of the flowers. But then we move in closer to that band, and suddenly the figure of the music becomes clearer, and the flowers are no longer that relevant. But then we realize, man, it's a warm day. I am really thirsty. Where is the water fountain? And when we start looking for the water fountain, we no longer pay attention to the music, nor do we pay attention to the flowers. So Lewin really helpfully describes this in this really succinct 5-word statement. The need organizes the field. So this, to me, explains how Gestalt formation and closure are related to this idea of getting needs met. We make clear figures, in this case, thirst. We find the water fountain that organizes the field. We're no longer interested in the flowers. We find the water fountain, we get the water, we integrate it into our being, and suddenly we can hear the music again, or we can ask the partner with, what do you feel like doing next? And we have room for another figure to emerge. So this is this ongoing process of health, which is identifying what the need is, moving towards it, addressing the need, getting closure on the need so that a new figure can emerge. The need organizes the field. So Seligman really underlines this in this way. He's actually talking about positive psychology here, but also the opposite of it, which is that we have a tendency to look at problems, right? At needs. So he says, consciousness is like your tongue. It swirls around in the mouth, looking for a cavity. And when it finds it, you focus on it. So we've all had this experience, right? There's something stuck in your teeth. This is actually a picture of my lovely wife when she was a child. I just wanted to use it because it's so sweet. We've all had that experience of getting something stuck in our teeth and we can't think about anything else, or we can't not think about it until we address it, until we find, a toothpick or whatever. So that's the tendency of that actually positive psychology is trying to address, is that we have a tendency to look at the thing that is the unfinished gestalt and get closure on it. And until we can do that, we can't move on. So actually, Gestalt theory has this idea of addressing unfinished business. The objective of Gestalt therapy is to enable the client to become more fully and creatively alive, to become free from the blocks and unfinished business that may diminish satisfaction, fulfillment, and growth, to experiment with new ways of being. So I use this image from the movie Up to exemplify this idea of an unfinished gestalt, right? Because Carl, the old man in the movie, if you've seen it, cannot let go of the guilt and remorse of not attending to this trip that he and Ellie, his wife, were going to make all the way to Venezuela to see this beautiful waterfall. So he eventually just puts balloons in his house and decides to go there and finally close that gestalt. Now, along the way of trying to follow that figure of literally getting to the waterfall, he encounters a new relationship with this helpful young boy who really allows him to transform his own identity into Carl's identity into a mentor, friend, rather than just somebody who's grieving his past wife. So it's an idea, and I think that movie exemplifies this idea of we get stuck and we need to get free of unfinished business in order to move forward. And this is the idea of Gestalt um, therapy. And really, the idea is that these needs will emerge. That's what the organism is trying to do, is finish business. So that is how something comes out of the clay, is that we start making sense of that clay based on our own experience, which is based on needs, unfinished business, emergent figures. So I'm going to make a connection here to projection then. Okay, so we've been talking about Gestalt formation and closure, this idea of finding figure, getting closure on it. It's related to this idea of projection. So most of us know this idea of projection. Here's a cartoon that exemplifies the therapist using projection, using a projective technique by saying, what does that one look like to you, right? And we look in those clouds and we actually do see shapes. We make sense of those shapes. One could say that we're doing Gestalt formation, figure formation and closure by seeing, oh, that's a face. I see a face in that cloud. That's related to this idea of we project something into that cloud shape, right? Sometimes, negatively, projection is this idea that we project our bad stuff onto other people. We say that race of people is not to be trusted, or those people on the political divide should not be part of my club, and they're bad and I'm good. So like the wicked stepmother here, finally the mirror gets real and talks back to her and says, yeah, but you're creating this whole narrative where Snow White is responsible for all your problems. So that's this idea that negatively speaking, if we're not conscious of projection, and one of the misuses of projection is that unconsciously we project the parts that we don't want to own onto other people. And I think that's the common understanding of projection. But it's a universal phenomena. We all do it. I think it's based in this idea of Gestalt figure formation, which is that, for example, when we even think about what gods look like, the gods of Ethiopians were inevitably black with flat noses, while those of the Thracians were blonde with blue eyes, right? So we project our own image of what God looks like onto that image of God. So it's universal, it has its problematic aspects, but it's also positively related to empathy, right? Because we look at this image of this little girl, we don't see somebody who's totally happy because of her face and the down balloon and her slumping posture. And so we use projection to imagine and to empathize with this child. So empathy provides us with an experiential access to others' minds, right? This is theory of mind. We project what we imagine on that person's experiences. And that's a good part of projection. Empathy simply refers to our ability to access the life of the mind of others in their bodily and behavioral expressions. So again, projection is real, it exists, it has its uses and misuses. So we've identified this idea of formation and closure, and we project the light bulb shape onto that image because we are familiar with light bulbs, right? The projective hypothesis is related to this, which is that personal interpretations of ambiguous stimuli like that light bulb must necessarily reflect the unconscious needs, motives, and conflicts of the examinee. So here's an example. Vincent van Gogh, this beautiful wheat field with crows, painted just months before he successfully suicided. So he's got a golden field, black crows, a darkening sky. We can imagine, we would project, especially what we know about Vincent van Gogh, that this is a very somber, not very cheerful, possibly even depressed image. However, as the Van Gogh Museum states, the menacing sky, the crows, and the dead-end path are said to refer to the end of his life approaching, but that is just a persistent myth. That is our projection of what it means. Van Gogh did want his wheat fields under stormy skies to express, quote, sadness, extreme loneliness, but at the same time, he wanted to show what he considered healthy and fortifying about the countryside. So we have to, I think the message is here, we have to be careful of our own projections onto other people's paintings, cards, sand tray, whatever we work with. We have to be very careful what meaning we place onto that, because at the same time that the child we're working with may be projecting something onto that whale they made in clay, we have a tendency to try to make sense of that whale also. Oh, that must mean that he has concerns about being overweight. Blake does not mention being overweight. That's our projection, right? So I want to broaden this a little bit because we do have projective assessments that are used. And in fact, Violet herself uses the house tree person drawing when she does her trainings. It's interesting though because she doesn't use the manual. And I think this is a difference in her work. I want to respect that there are these different projective assessments, and I want to distinguish how her work is different. So the house tree person drawing is, I just want you to draw any picture that has at least a tree, a person, and a house in it, right? And Violet will just go around and say, so it looks like you're sitting in that, you're reading a book under the tree there. You want me to tell you what I think that means? And the child might say, yeah. And she'll say, well, it looks to me like that person really likes to have alone time. And the child and she'll say, is that right? And the child says, actually, this was just that one afternoon I was thinking of, and nobody was home, and so I was feeling a little bit lonely, and I just read underneath the tree. And so then Violet hasn't told the child what that means. The child has told Violet what that means. And I think that's a key distinction in her work. Because the interpretation manual of the house tree person, according to this approach of Violet, goes a little far in terms of interpreting what stuff means. So for example, windows, doors, and sidewalks from the manual says, are all ways that others enter or see into the house. So they relate to openness, willingness to interact with others, and ideas about the environment. Thus, shade, shutters, bars, curtains, and long and winding sidewalks indicate some unwillingness to reveal much about yourself. So I would take exception to that as somebody who is working from this approach, the Oaklander approach. Those shade, shutters, bars, and curtains don't necessarily mean that. And in this approach, we let the person we're working with unpack what that image means by being it. Because it's their process, we're trusting, again, this Gestalt formation and closure, figure formation, we're trusting that whatever that shade, shutter, whatever needs to mean will come from the child's point of view. It doesn't help them necessarily to hear what my point of view is. So here is an example of a house tree person. You'll see that there is a house, a tree, and a person. You can, interpret this in many ways. For example, let's just take the scream at the top, ah! So you could interpret that the child's angry or whatever. But in the Oaklander approach, we just say, so what about this part? And down at the lower left-hand corner, the child says, I like to be heard. Like, if I'm trying to say one of my ideas and people are talking over me, I yell to be heard. So that's an interesting statement. It doesn't necessarily mean that this child has anger issues. All right, so another example of projective assessment is what's called the RATC, the Roberts Apperception Test for Children and Adolescents. In it, the child is presented with these ambiguous stimuli, like in this case, an image of a small family. You're imagining their family, I'm imagining their family, and the adult male is talking to what looks like a teenage girl, but it may be somebody who's gender nonconforming or whatever, right? And the child is asked, tell us a story about this image. So there's no right or wrong per se about what the child would say about this image. But I do think what's interesting is over time, the more images the child is shown of ambiguous stimuli, certain themes might emerge, especially this test assumes in the way that the child gets closure on the figure, gets closure on the story. So if there's a consistent theme of abuse, neglect, betrayal, hurt. That's a significant theme that emerges, right? Um, and there is a manual and so forth. So from this perspective of the RATSI, a projective technique is used to interpret the child's experience. From the Oaklander experience, they're letting the child tell you what to make of this meaning. The manual doesn't give us that information. So the Rorschach is probably the most famous and maybe most ridiculed in some ways, and yet there's a lot of research behind this document and different ways that it is used by different people. So you may see this image as anything from a hip bones to two Native American figures talking to each other to almost fighting frisbee players. Who knows what you're going to see, right? And again, the Rorschach does have a manual that on this card says Mark gives his first human movement response. The percept indicates some capacity for empathy, which is then mitigated by Mark's progressive distancing of the human elements of these figures. They are changed from ladies to old ladies and then to ghosts floating on a cloud. This tendency to rework human percepts and to mythologize them indicates an alienation in object relations. I'm going to step back from this and say this is what the Rorschach does, and they are using projection. This is not the Oaklander approach, right? We do not come up with these summary statements about what the child's projection means. We let the child, we trust that the ongoing process of health, of finding a figure, making sense of it, addressing it, is us supporting their ongoing development and health, and they don't necessarily need the manual to do that. So I put a question mark after this one because there really are some bogus ways in which pop psychology has been used. This tree test reveals the dominant personality traits. Choose one to know yours. So we get hooked into, oh yeah, this would tell us all about us. But really, it's us who tells us about us. And I think what's wonderful about the Oaklander approach is we discover us through doing this process, through doing clay work, etc. And I think we have to be careful of this misuse of projective work. It's sort of the idea that, you go to a cocktail party or whatever, and you walk up and somebody says, so what do you do? And you say, oh, I'm a graduate student in psychology. And they say, oh, are you gonna analyze me? That's the negative side that psychology has taken on, this negative interpretation, because of this sort of old school Freudian, I'll tell you what your symbols mean. And the reason why I've spent some time trying to distance Oaklander from that is she is using projection, but she's using it in a different way, and I think in a more respectful and supportive way rather than an interpretive and analytic way. So another example, Kezia says, I'm this rose. I represent love and caring. People take care of me. These thorns protect me from getting picked. People admire me for being beautiful. I say, how is it being a beautiful rose? I'm just asking her more about her experience, right? That's a good thing and a bad thing. Good in that I'm loved, bad in that people can be using me. And I say, how are you like this rose in your own life? And she says, the thorns are like my parents who are overprotective. I also get complimented for being caring a lot. So what's interesting to me about that is, you would maybe interpret that the thorns were her, right? But no, the thorns in her experience are her overprotective parents, and I would have known that if I had interpreted her thorns differently. So Devin picks this picture card to represent his experience before group. He says, I picked this picture with a bunch of colors because we're all of these colors. We're just walking around and we never even noticed each other before. So again, that's like, wow, how did he get that out of that drawing, right? But that's his interpretation. It's a bunch of people walking around who we might not even notice before. His second card, during group, he says, this goes with the picture that I have with the colors. You two leaders represent these two poles, these wooden poles in this drawing, this picture, and you're stopping us from being just these colors just going around without us even noticing each other. You two represent the two poles by stopping us and not letting us continue on where we're trying to go. So what is that stopping? What does that do? And says the leader, and Devin says, that's just bringing us closer together to become friends because we wouldn't have even noticed each other in the first place. I love that image, thinking of kids passing each other in the hallways in middle school. The leader says, so we kind of slow things down and provide a space for you all to be together, whereas otherwise you all would have been ships in the night walking right past each other. So again, we could have looked at this drawing and interpreted it ourselves as, somebody who's shy, hiding behind these poles, but Devin brings a completely different meaning to it. Before, during, and after the group, this child, these three images are, before the group, I was this egg. I was in my egg. I was just with my group of friends, and I didn't really get out of my egg. But then during the group, I did. I was just a small animal, and I kind of ventured out from my friend group, and I got a couple of friends, but not huge friends. But now I learned how to stand up to bullies, and I'm trying to find new friends as well. So what's interesting to me is this picture, this drawing of the two wolves face to face there, it's really ambiguous. They could be fighting or they could be friends, right? He brought the meaning that he knows how to stand up to bullies, which I think is important. He's not the aggressor in this case. He's the one who has learned to stand up. And that's a very different interpretation than I might have brought, like, oh, he's interested in fighting. Okay, so Violet says, since our projections come from inside us, from our own experiences, from what we know and care about, they tell us a lot about our sense of self. Our projection is the only way, often projection is the only way a child is willing to disclose herself. She may say things as a puppet or to a puppet that she would never say directly to me. What's interesting to me about this is this word directly, because all of the work that Violet also does is indirect. She has you first being this puppet, being a piece of clay. You're not looking at each other. You're playing with the puppets. You're looking at the piece of clay. You're gazing at this drawing of the rose. It's indirect contact, but paradoxically, it gets so immediate and direct because I think it's safer to talk indirectly for child. This is what I think Violet is bringing up here. They'll say something in play, then they won't say directly to you. So it's interesting because I was working with a gentleman and he brought this card to me, right? So I'm going to read McCormick's quote first. He says, when confronted by a metaphor, a figure, an image, we cannot resist attempting to understand it. Metaphors are instruments for the stimulation of emotions. So when he brought this card to me, I did have my emotions stimulated. I was like, whoa, this guy's got... honestly, this is what I thought. Okay, this is a big guy. He's sitting down next to me. He's going to, talk about power, and maybe this is going to be about aggression. Who knows what's going to come up here? But man, I felt something with this card. Little did I know when I asked him, so what stands out to you in this drawing? He said, and I was expecting him to say the bear, and he said, the bubbles. And I said, oh, really? Tell me about the bubbles. And he said, and I speak as if you are those bubbles. And he said, I'm these bubbles. I'm sort of made of more than one thing. I'm both air and water, and I'm between the deep part of the water and the air up above it, and I'm traveling, I'm moving into this in-between space. And this led to a whole real sort of description of what was real in his life at that moment, which was that he was in between professions. He was a little bit anxious about the direction he was moving. He felt a little insecure. So totally different than the bear being figural, right? So for him, the figure of the bubbles was figural, the bear was not. And I need to practice as a discipline allowing what becomes figural to him and going with it, not what's figural to me as the counselor. So one of my favorite quotes from Violet is, when I let go and can allow myself to imagine these things, I'm actually coming back to myself because they're always projections. Fantasy in this way gives us access to our own real experience. Fantasy gives us access to our own real experience. This is to me sort of the most wonderful and interesting aspect of what I've learned from Oaklander and how to facilitate that and the courage it takes, as in Violet's face here, to play and to evoke imagination and sensory engagement and pretend as if conversation before we try to figure out what's going on or what the issue is. We let it emerge. we let the figure form, we do that through progression, through projection, and then we know what to work on, right? So it comes from the regulatory capacity of the child, which I'll be speaking more about next week, which is what is the connection between Gestalt formation, projection, and this larger concept of self-regulation, which is, I think, what underlies Violet's work, both contact and self-regulation. We'll be talking about that next week. So here's Violet and her son, Mahatma. Part of Violet's genius, I say, seems to be her insight into providing the opportunity for individuals to speak indirectly about themselves. These two folks aren't looking at each other, they're looking at this card. By not confronting the individuals with whom she works head-on and face-to-face, Violet provides the safety that can allow individuals to stick their necks out and take a few self-disclosing risks. I think that also is because she helps them play, and when you engage in play, all kinds of stuff happens, which we'll be talking about a couple weeks from now. So this week we talked about examples of at least 3 of Oaklander's therapeutic experiences: clay, sand tray, drawings, music, etc. The 4-part structure: imagine it, make it, be it, does it fit? Example prompts from all 4 parts of those pieces of the structure. And we talked about this idea of Gestalt formation and projection helping play become real. I think in essence because the ongoing process of Gestalt formation and this added component in this Oaklander approach of projection helps us see what's real for us, helps us see what's figural. Are we thirsty? Are we in need? Are we tired? We differentiate aspects of ourself in order to feel connected to those parts of ourself. We'll talk about that later in these lectures as well. So we also did examples of projective assessments. And I was trying to problematize both the uses and the misuses of projection and differentiate how Violet's work is distinct from a lot of the other approaches that are used. So this was Play Becomes Real Part 2, and thank you for your attention. I hope you'll be able to hear Part 3 soon. Thank you.